Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily. And if you want more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving on to our today's first story. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business. The owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. To make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours, pay by supposedly going into the office during her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her lies on several occasions and being warned about trying to claim unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. To avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening several times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come to work on the weekend or after hours to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee both verbally and in writing that they could not book time off for the dates in question, since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter. Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continuing series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and that she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly, after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit or retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned, retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so. Let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required, since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were the property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards that had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further, and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages instead of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire, and not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire, am not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was the property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ travel agency, who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. To de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, or retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. Now, here is the end of our today's story, and I hope you guys are enjoying my content. So before leaving, you can share your thought about Jane and the petty revenge OP took on her in the comments section. Also hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more satisfying revenge stories. Moving to our final story about revenge on entitled parents. Background: I met Brian in law school. We were roommates our first year and became really good friends ever since. After we both graduated, Brian went into corporate law with a large tech company, and I went to work for a firm. After about 5 years, Brian's company went public and he made out like a bandit. He worked for another 2 years and decided he hated working in the corporate world, and became a high school government and history teacher, and has never been happier. Brian gets his fair share of crazy parents and bad students, but there was never any student that gave him so much grief as Minnie Karen. From the moment Minnie Karen started high school, she had the reputation of being incredibly spoiled, lazy, demanding, and having entitled parents. Whenever any of her teachers didn't give her a good grade she liked, Minnie Karen's mom, Karen, showed up on campus and caused a huge scene. To avoid Karen, many teachers just passed Minnie Karen to get rid of her. Not only was Minnie Karen a bad student but also incredibly mean. She was rude to teachers and students alike. If you weren't in her good graces, she bullied the hell out of you. The sad part was that Minnie Karen never got in trouble because Minnie Karen's parents were very generous donators to the school, so the administration always sucked up to them like they were royalty. Eventually, it was Minnie Karen's senior year and Brian was the only government teacher, so he had to have her in his class. The thing about Brian is that he will never give out a grade a student doesn't deserve. Most of his colleagues told him to just get out of Minnie Karen's way and just focus on the kids that needed help. However, Brian wasn't about to compromise himself for a spoiled kid. The first progress reports come out and Minnie Karen has a D. Minnie Karen complains to Brian first. She not only insults Brian as being a teacher but threatens to make false accusations against him like sexual harassment claims. When Brian calls her bluff, Minnie Karen stomps away defeated. At the end of the day, Brian couldn't go to the administration to let them know what just happened. He had to wait for the next day. The next morning, Karen shows up at school wearing some kind of expensive designer suit, oversized sunglasses, and high heels and all. She barges into Brian's classroom and starts screaming her head off. He sits there calmly and just lets her yell all she wants. After Karen is done, Brian simply states that if Minnie Karen doesn't do the work, she gets a bad grade. Karen eventually threatens the same accusations as Minnie Karen, and legal actions if Brian doesn't comply, as her husband is a powerful lawyer. Again, Brian calls Karen on her bluff and she leaves, simply saying that Brian is going to regret his decision. A few days later, Brian gets called into the principal's office. In the office is the principal, the dean, entitled Dad Bob, Karen, Minnie Karen, and a school counselor. I wasn't given a word-for-word conversation, but in this meeting, Bob and Karen accuse Brian of sexually harassing Minnie Karen and that if Minnie Karen doesn't give him sexual favors, he'll flunk her. Both Karen and Minnie Karen made a dramatic telling where Karen cried and Minnie Karen would tear up and quiver telling her story. The counselor kept comforting Minnie Karen and Karen, telling them to be strong while shooting dagger glances at Brian. There was a little bit of back and forth. Of course, Brian denied everything, but the principal, the dean, and the counselor didn't seem to believe Brian. Brian was immediately placed on unpaid leave, pending an investigation of accusations. Without missing a beat, Brian starts preparing his case and his defense. However, being out of practice a bit, Brian calls me to help him to do some research, and maybe represent him since I was in litigation. In less than 24 hours, the entire school knows what is going on and the parents as well. The school is more or less split. Most of the students supported Brian. Most of the teachers also loved Brian, including his department, so he had their support as well. A week later, there was another hearing at the district office with the superintendent and the school board to decide what was going to happen to Brian, and if there were going to be any criminal charges. During the hearing, Bob, Karen, and Minnie Karen portray themselves as victims and make Brian out as some kind of predator. Even though it was a private hearing, they brought their entire extended family and all of Minnie Karen's friends were there too. They weren't allowed into the room itself, but they made their presence known. When we arrived at the hearing, there was a lot of screaming, swearing, and yelling. I thought we needed security, but no one was getting physical, luckily. When the hearing started, Minnie Karen was asked to state their side again, and as you can imagine, it got even more dramatic and again she was in tears. I look over at the parents and Bob is holding a crying Karen in his arms. When it was Brian's turn, we both get up and present our side. Throughout the entire time Brian was talking, Karen would scream out calling Brian a liar and trash. Brian kept his composure and I give him mad props. At the end of his story, Brian breaks out his trump card, which was video recordings of both encounters. Every class had cameras in the classroom and the halls. They were also recording 24/7 and back to the classroom computer. There were no clouds back then, at least not for schools yet. Anyways, as the videos were playing, I look at the family and I just see their faces drop and go pale. You could almost see the cartoon cloud bubble appear above their heads saying, "Oh duck." At this point, we knew we basically won, so to say. The superintendent asks Bob and his family if they have any proof of their accusations, but they couldn't produce a thing. Bob tried to dismiss the video saying it was an invasion of privacy, but every student and parent sign a contract at the beginning of each school year, wherein the contracting student and parents agree to academic standards and acknowledges there are cameras in the school where appropriate. In the aftermath, Mini Karen gets expelled from the district and the superintendent initiates an investigation into the administration, because they don't understand why the principal and dean didn't ask to see the security videos in the first place. The principal and dean were eventually forced to resign from their positions because the investigations revealed their bias against the family and were not impartial. In this mess, they found mountains of complaints against Karen and Mini Karen, but they never did anything about it. After the hearing, there was a huge backlash on the family and the community, and they went into hiding, sort of. However, for Brian, he was not done. Brian isn't usually the vindictive type, but in this case, he was livid. If he didn't have his evidence and was convicted, obviously his career was over, but he'd have to register as a sex offender and his life would be over. The fact that this family would go this far to ruin a person's life for a damn grade made him snap. Brian wanted this family to be punished more, so he spent his next summer finding out as much dirt as he could. Brian finds out that not only was Bob doing a lot of unethical practices as an attorney, including bribery, intimidation, and more, but he was also having an affair with the front desk girl at his firm by hiring a private investigator. On top of that, his firm wasn't that big, but he lived a life where the firm should have been 10 times that size for the way they were living. After gathering all of his information, he submitted the information to the state's bar and IRS. Bob ended up getting disbarred for malpractice, audited by the IRS, and exposed as a cheater to Karen. Karen portrayed herself as some trophy wife and community leader, and was also exposed to skimming donations into her pocket from the donations. She was arrested for stealing and is now on trial. As for Mini Karen, CPS removed her from the family and placed them with relatives. Now, here is the end of our today's video, and I hope you enjoyed this revenge. Guys, I want to hear your thought about this story in the comments section, and if you had similar encounter with entitled Karen, please share it. I would love to read them. And before you leave, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to remain updated on more fantastic stories.